Hello everybody and welcome to the War Room for this week's midweek event headlined by Anthony Smith and Glover Teixeira. I'm glad this fight stayed together because we were looking forward to this one. I've been chatting with the boys and this is a really good matchup for a lot of reasons. One, because you know exactly what to expect from Glover Teixeira. You know, we've seen him a lot. We know his game. We're not seeing any major developments in his game. We're just seeing strengthening of what he's already good at. Anthony Smith, still, I feel like people don't quite fully understand who he is as a 205er. You know, he was kind of middle of the road as a middleweight. Half of his battle was the scales. You know, his last fight at middleweight was against Thiago Santos, and after that he came up to light heavyweight and has just looked really, really good ever since. Picking up one unanimous decision, lost to John Jones. But see, this is the thing: is like in that fight we didn't really get to learn about Anthony Smith too much. He didn't take any real damage. He just didn't get started in the fight. And I've had a couple of really interesting conversations with him since that fight, and he reflected upon it. I spoke to him the week after the fight actually, and he basically was talking about there being no surprises for him. Like everything that he expected from John Jones he got, but it was quite surreal, so it never allowed him to get started. Like defensively, he did great work. Didn't really take any punches at all in that fight, but just wasn't able to get started. And I know that feeling. But then you've got to think after that fight, he came into his next one against Gustafsson, who I would say is as tough, almost as tough a test as John Jones for Gustafsson, for Anthony Smith, and he looked amazing in that fight. I mean, like career best performance. And I think that there are a lot of things that we saw in Smith's fight against Gustafsson that I think he'll use in this fight against Teixeira. It's also interesting to note that it's a common opponent. Glover Teixeira was stopped by Gustafsson. The one thing that it's worth keeping in mind is that was a Gustafsson of a different time, and I don't know whether the Gustafsson that fought Smith was the same Gustafsson that fought Teixeira back in the day. Because, back in the day, Gustafsson's footwork, uppercuts coming up the centre and hitting Teixeira clean were a big problem for Teixeira in that fight. And he just didn't look the same against Anthony Smith. So it's not as comparable because it's a common opponent, but it's not, the performance of the common opponent wasn't the same, if you like. The interesting thing about that, though, is the uppercuts that Gustafsson's used against Teixeira, I think Anthony Smith will use. Anyway, let's get into the details of this one. So Glover Teixeira, he's a good black belt. He's a good boxer. He likes to walk himself into close range, use his head movement, use his guard, and just throw nice fundamental boxing combinations. There's nothing particularly flamboyant about Glover Teixeira's style. Anthony Smith, he's a black belt. I think he's a more recent black belt than Glover Teixeira. We've seen little bits of his ground game. We saw his ground game defense in the Volkan Özdemir fight. We also obviously saw his rear naked choke finish against Gustafsson as well. He is a good black belt. He does move very well on the floor. I don't think he'll be worried about going to the ground with Teixeira. I just think he'll defend takedowns just to be stubborn and difficult and try and keep a striking range. It's the striking ranges where they get most of their differences. Smith works from the outside very well. He fights very long range. He's very kind of loose. He's very smart. He's very educated. He picks his shots very well. And he doesn't put his foot on the gas and overexert himself unless he knows there's a good reason for it. Like, think back to the Shogun fight. Now, there's a danger when you're a young, and I say young fighter, and I don't say that in a disrespectful way. I say that in a place in his career. When it comes to Smith, like, he's in an early phase of his career, especially as a light heavyweight. What's interesting is all the experience he's got. He's got so much experience, but he has kind of been learning on the job, and that's why he's become such a good fighter. Why he's become such a smart fighter. I could get into the whole backstory of him. He took his first fight on short notice. Like, basically, he was in the arena there to watch the fights. They were short of an opponent. He put his hand up and got stuck in, and it's that feeling of fear, that adrenaline rush that he got from that first fight that he's been chasing ever since. And he's just a very cerebral individual. And I think that's what causes an issue for Teixeira in this fight, is the fact that Anthony Smith, he won't get drawn into a brawl. He won't stand in the pocket and trade with Glover Teixeira. So think of Anthony Smith on the outside, playing the range game very well, touching him, jabbing him, poking him with the kicks, but nothing that's inside of Glover's boxing range. So constantly Glover's having to step closer to Anthony Smith to try and land something. Anthony Smith's constantly moving back and moving away. And I was actually surprised how well he did with his range management against Gustafsson, because Gus is excellent with his footwork. He moves very well, moves through range very well, and switches his tools from long range to short range as he goes, long range punches to uppercuts. I thought Smith was going to have more problems with Gustafsson in the striking range than he did. And when I watched that fight back, I mean, Smith really doesn't get hit unless he's trying to hit Gustafsson at the same time. Every time Gustafsson throws, Smith is not there to be touched. And with someone who's got a reach and height like Gustafsson, you would think he would have a better time against Smith. So that leads me to believe that Glover Teixeira is really going to have a hard time getting close to him. So I think Smith is going to play the long-range game. I think he's going to pick him off from distance. I think we're going to see Glover Teixeira trying to walk into that boxing range and trying to land some punches. But ultimately, if I'm Glover Teixeira coming into this one, I'm thinking I can big brother him, because I've been a light heavyweight from my whole career. Anthony Smith just come up from middleweight a few fights ago, so I'm going to feel, if I'm Teixeira, like I'm a bigger fighter, like I'm a more experienced black belt. And like my best chance of beating this guy is to get my hands on him and drag him down to the floor. So I expect Glover Teixeira to be quite proactive in his takedowns. I think he's going to try and get close into range where he can land his punches, but as a way of getting into to work his takedowns. So I think we're going to see Smith moving around, using his counter strike and defending takedowns to start with. And Smith will build into the fight. One thing we learned about the Jones fight, to his detriment, was that he's very, very patient, too patient. When we saw the patience in the Gustafsson fight, it worked really well for him because he just didn't take any damage. He never overexerted himself and got the finish really, really cleanly in that fight, in my opinion. So I think he's going to be just as relaxed against Glover Teixeira. I think Smith knows that this is his fight to give away. Like we've seen the best of Glover Teixeira. We know what he's capable of. It's very capable, no doubt. But with Smith, I still think we're learning about his game. When it comes to the submissions, and those of you that watched the Cowboy Pettis fight breakdown that I did, I talked about offensive and defensive submissions, and the fact that Pettis uses defensive submissions, fighting off his back, attacking guillotines when he's defending takedowns, those kind of things. Both of these guys are offensive submission guys. They both put you in a bad position where they work arm triangles, they work to take your back. Neither of them are particularly driven to get the submission finish over everything else. I mean, Glover's got a couple of recent submission finishes, but I don't feel like he's going to be pushed to get the finish in this fight. I feel like he's going to want to take Anthony Smith down and control him and start to slowly progress. Anthony Smith will take a submission if it's there, but both of these guys will beat you up until the submission's available. I'm just looking at. Yeah, you see, so Glover Teixeira came out against Carl Robertson and got that takedown early and got that first round arm triangle. Like, I can see him trying to chase something like that with Smith, but I think he's going to respect Smith's ground game a lot more than he has previous opponents. Like, he's coming off a 3-fight win streak. You look at the opponents: Carl Robertson, Ion Cutelaba, and Nikita Krylov. I would say, as good as those fights are, and a split decision to Krylov as well. Krylov's a good fighter, but he's not at the same level of Anthony Smith. I would say Smith's one submission win over Gustafsson outweighs all those 3 victories of Glover. I would also say that Glover fighting Gustafsson, even the Gustafsson of now, wouldn't have as much success as Smith did. So I feel like this is Smith's fight to give away. I feel like there are ways that Glover can win this fight, but it's all about getting himself into close range and landing his boxing combinations, getting the fight to the floor and working his submissions. The longer this fight goes, the more Smith is going to pick him apart and take his time. I was trying to think of an analogy of the way that Smith approaches this, and it's a bit like Jenga. So if I'm Anthony Smith, I'm not looking at getting in there and smashing that whole pile of blocks down straight away. What Anthony Smith will do is he'll wait, he'll look exactly like he did in the Gustafsson fight. He'll remove a piece and he'll see how the stability is. And then he'll take another piece and he'll see how the stability is. And it's not until he sees the whole stack starting to wave back and forth that he goes in for the finish. Just because the Shogun fight was a very fast one, it doesn't mean that it wasn't a considered process. Like, before he started that flurry, he already knew that Shogun was hurt. Like, the flurry was as a result of him seeing weakness in Shogun. So even if it takes him 3 or 4 rounds to land something clean on Glover, he's not going to chase after him and try and get the finish until he sees that there's already a vulnerability being exposed. That's what makes this very difficult for Glover, because Smith is not in a rush. He's not going to step into punching range and start trading. He's going to stay on the outside. He's going to make Glover come to him. He's going to defend takedowns even if he's not bothered to go to the ground. And I think even if it hits the ground, I think Smith is more than willing and capable to grapple with Glover Teixeira. I think Glover's got to make the most of that the kind of the calmness of Anthony Smith. He's got to take the fight to him, but not be too reckless about it, because walking onto stuff from Smith, if he catches you clean with something and sees you rocked, he doesn't let you get out of that round. A really, really fun fight. I still think we're going to see a lot more from Anthony Smith in the rest of his career, and I think Glover's there now to validate the other fighters coming up and rising through the rankings. Really exciting fight. Glover's got to get close to him, though, otherwise he's going to get picked off at a distance, and it's going to be a very long night for him. Anyway, enjoy the fights. See you next time.